There's a type of show that I will watch and rewatch basically anytime I need something on my screen. When I'm eating on my lunch break, if I'm unwell, as I have been recently, and I'm on that sofa right there, desperate for something I know I'll like, if I'm pretending to be productive and have the script I'm working on open on one screen, but am actually, in fact, not working on the script at all, or I'm just having a slow day at work. There are a few shows I go for: HBO's Rome, It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia, BoJack Horseman, Archer. I'm really painting a picture of the kind of person I am with these choices, but those are the shows I'll go for, and one that I sometimes forget about, but will fall into a month-long period of just throwing into this rotation, is Peep Show, a sitcom written by David Mitchell and Robert Webb about two flatmates, Mark and Jez, who are just running into the ludicrous complications of simply trying to exist in the UK, which is always going to be a somewhat timeless commentary. It's important at the start of this video that I say up front, I love this show. Of course, some episodes are more memorable and less cringe-inducing on a rewatch than others, and there are definitely parts I would maybe rethink, but overall, it's a really good show with lots of moments that I quote offhand all the time. Particular favourite of mine is "We could be men with Ven." The weird thing about this is Peep Show is centrist art, and you may have noticed that I am not the biggest fan of centrists. I should be clear, it's both art by centrists, but also art that exists in and propagates the ideology of it. Specifically a very 2000s New Labour-ish centrism, which isn't exactly an ideology that's known for producing art that really stands up beyond nostalgia. I guess that's also how I describe the ideology in the governments it's produced, actually, so, it all kind of lines up. In fact, I would struggle to name centrist cultural output that is particularly interesting, or at least interesting enough that I would want to make a video about it, let alone one where I'm going to be positive, being as it is an ideology that is largely practiced by people who are invested in the status quo and in the orthodox assumptions of party politics, especially in the UK. Which means that a lot of the art they produce, the TV shows, the podcasts, the YouTube videos, movies, really annoying comedy panel shows that can't handle anything to their left existing, it's all just kind of plain for my tastes. Like rice. It can be used as a great part of a whole meal, but if you just serve me a heaping bowl of plain rice with no toppings or like soy sauce, I'm just not going to be that compelled by it. That's the thing that interests me about Peep Show. It's a show that exists comfortably within a particular status quo, and being a sitcom where a regression to a status quo is a tendency within the genre, it produces an interesting commentary on the ideology that created the world it's set in, through the way that Mark and Jez and everyone around them keep regressing to their status quo, which, like a lot of TV and films from that period, feels like it's in a different country to the one we live in now. If you want an example of one, I actually did a video about the film Four Lions, which overlaps with the runtime of the show and is easily my favourite video I've ever done. Go check it out. I want to say that it is perfectly possible to produce something that's safe and operates within the status quo, that's compelling, or just plain good and fun. Not everything is going to have a secret Marxism element to it. In fact, I think there's actually another show from this period that is explicitly a kind of centrist commentary rooted in the conditions of the 2000s New Labour era, but is actually good, which is The Thick of It, which qualifies both as art by a centrist, in this case Armando Iannucci, who you will know from The Death of Stalin, or if you're American, from Veep. It's also just very safe and very party agnostic and anti-political in that, I think all politicians are bad, but I'll keep voting for that garbage as long as it's my team kind of way that you encounter, particularly with centrists online. Of the two, Peep Show is the one that I think endures better and is more influential, in part because of something we'll talk about in a second in more detail about Mark and Jez, which is that they're just David Mitchell and Robert Webb playing themselves, which I know can be interpreted as an insult or a negative comment, but really isn't in this case and is actually kind of fine sometimes, if you're asking me. The other reason is Peep Show is much less of a grandstand, or at least an explicit grandstand, and so it can't really be made to age poorly by subsequent events. There's an argument that as satire, the thick of it feels more like a victory lap for the kind of politics it's trying to make fun of, just because Armando Iannucci ended up aligning pretty directly with the supposed subjects of his satire, whereas Peep Show is just more general interest and about two guys who just kind of suck from opposite ends of the spectrum of shitty guys from the 2000s. Though I will say, shitty guys do just kind of suck no matter what decade they belong to. And because it's more general, for people around my age and older and probably a bit younger, it's left a pretty substantial footprint, especially because it was a show that translated really well into memes. Rather funnily, given the topic of the video, often into political memes that I remember from the 2017 election. My favorite one, and if I find it, I will put up a picture of it, was at a really horrible pop punk night I used to go to at the time. After the 2017 election, they had a Halloween all-nighter, and they had these sort of handwritten notes up all over the place, and one of them said, 4 bank holidays, Jeremy, 4. That's insane. By that point, it had been 2 years since the show had ended, and way more since that episode that it was referencing first aired. And there it was, and we all knew what it was from. I think that endurance and just the fact that it wasn't trying to explicitly say the things that it said, but it came out in the wash, is what makes it so good as a show. But also it shows that you can play within the boundaries of a dying ideology and produce something great. You can't talk about Peep Show without talking about the main characters, Mark and Jez, whose internal monologues we're privy to, whose ups and downs give the series its shape, and who are excellently played by David Mitchell and Robert Webb. I want to touch on the performance of the characters because I have upset people before on certain microblogging sites when I've said that the big reason Mark and Jez work so well is that it's David Mitchell and Robert Webb playing themselves. I think the reason why this rankles is that people assume this is an insult, or that I'm saying that the show is devalued by that. But speaking as someone who plays themselves on camera, that's not always true. Any YouTuber, certainly any that shows their face, is to some extent playing themselves in a role. So I actually really appreciate this in Peep Show, because much like how this channel allows me to say things I might not otherwise say, I think through Mark and Jez, they're saying things they might have believed or really wanted to say but wouldn't really say, either because it's just not polite or appropriate, or because the thought itself is liable to alienate people you don't want to alienate. If we look at who Mark and Jez are at their core, and at the way those two conduct themselves, you do see parallels that put the characters in the show in a slightly different light. In Mark, what you have is an aspirational, vaguely middle class, grasping, uptight, deeply unpleasant person who exists as a stereotype of a kind of small c conservative awkward guy who's permanently in a state of anxiety because he has to live in a world where he's subjected to externalities, and was probably made fun of for liking nerdy things once upon a time, who doesn't hesitate to put people who don't follow the script of how he thinks life should be lived in their place. Like that rant he subjects Sophie's friends to in defense of various aspects of the status quo after their drug-fueled night out. That has this sort of West Wing, I have owned the subjects of my derision through my sheer wit and authority vibe. But it's actually more pathetic than anything on the West Wing, because it's so small time and interpersonal, which is similarities to how centrism has evolved as an ideology in the UK. It has become smaller and smaller and smaller and pettier and pettier and pettier. Then you have Jez, who I find to be a more interesting character because he's a type of guy that doesn't really exist anymore. The slacker who crashes in his mate's spare room and is always chasing some artistic aspiration in a half-assed way, is a relic of the 2000s, one that in some ways I can understand people being envious of, but it's also something that is so uncommon now that it's basically extinct, especially in the post-2008 crash context. Once you strip away that sort of Gen X slacker veneer, Jez at his core is a shallow, faux-enlightened, intellectually inadequate guy, and again, just like Mark, is an unpleasant person at his core. Someone who is so desperate for a shortcut to success that he actively seeks to exploit the talent of people around him while demanding that he be treated as if he has merit. It's also interesting that Jez, whenever he's properly challenged, crumbles, especially if it's in aid of something he's feigning passion for. There are two good examples that come to mind. One is when he's asked to do the music for a former school friend's, I mean, he's not really a friend, judging from the way he tells the story, but the school friend's advert, and it just spirals into catastrophe while colliding with the fact that Mark's new best friend is a racist. Yeah, there's a lot going on in that episode, but the main takeaway for this part is that Jez is given a great opportunity and just squanders it because the truth is his only passion for music is as a vehicle to coast to a comfortable life. The other example is one that came courtesy of the YouTube algorithm. Rare success for the YouTube algorithm there, because it reminded me of this scene which you're seeing the thumbnail for now, where Jeremy compares Hitler to Jesus in an attempt to impress his boyfriend slash partner slash person he's in a like free directional relationship with. Look, this stuff gets complicated and weird in this episode, but it really is a great microcosm of Jez as a character and Robert Webb. Jez thinks he can take on an expert in his own field and gets his own stupid questions that are attempts to look like a deep, free thinker answered easily by someone who actually knows what they're talking about, which leads him to kind of fade quickly from that conversation after an attempt to escalate, which is where you get that comparison. It's hard not to compare this to Robert Webb's most notorious intervention on an issue, which was the time he decided to come out as a transphobe by tweeting out support for an article attacking the charity Mermaids. This happened around late 2018, as I recall, which was a little too early for him to sort of fall into the position that many other public figures have, especially because his opposition to mermaids turned out to be paper thin. Much like when Jez was trying to compare Jesus and Hitler, when he was actually scrutinized, he basically had nothing of substance to say and tried to walk back the more extreme associations his actions had created, simultaneously standing by his comments claiming to oppose transphobia, but also not being able to recall the substance of his issue with the charity. Here's a hint and a bit of speculation on my part. It's because the charity supported trans children and their families. You can still read the article, by the way, that he supported, but I wouldn't recommend it because it's shit. After this, he basically skulked away and, to my knowledge, hasn't really made a noteworthy intervention on the topic since. Now, that could be because transphobes in the UK have become so extreme that Robert Webb's vibes-based opposition is just not showing up on the radar anymore, but considering how deranged other public figures have become once they started indulging in this, it's a small mercy, I guess, that he hasn't fully embraced the way of weird, divorced, convicted criminal Graham Linehan. My speculation, and I want to emphasize that this is speculation, is that unlike Graham Linehan, Robert Webb has friends, and those friends were willing to tell him to pack it in and wrap it up because he looked really weird engaging in this. A further speculation I'll engage in is that I think Robert Webb probably saw other equally shallow, and if we're being honest, ones that engaged in similar behavior, including blackface, which Robert Webb also did in this show, to be allowed to reinvent themselves as public intellectuals, which means it's now time to talk about the blackface scene and address that yet again. I am talking about a British comedy from the 2000s and having to talk about blackface. I actually did a video a while ago on David Baddiel, who is a contemporary of Robert Webb, and also tried to make these big decisive interventions in politics and was much more successful in that. There are quite a few unfortunately recent blackface incidents in British comedy, and I guess you could kick that out to the wider Anglosphere with stuff like Tropic Thunder. My thought on this is that a lot of comedians who made it in the 90s and 2000s felt that racism was a settled issue and we'd settled on it being bad, so there was space to ironically do racism by engaging in racist practices. Stop me if you've heard that one before. We should understand that the blackface scene in Peep Show exists in that context, and it doesn't make it acceptable. And I do get that the joke is that Jez is so beholden to his lust, I guess, that he'll cave and do almost anything to satisfy it. This is a joke that recurs, and I guess unlike what David Baddiel did, this was at least a joke that is plausible to understand as being made at Jez's expense. It feels less mean-spirited than other contemporary examples like Little Britain, but it does jar quite a bit with everything else about the show. On Netflix, the specific scene was pulled because of the blackface, and to be honest, I had totally forgotten about it until YouTube, once again we're talking about YouTube, recommended a video on the official Peep Show channel with the blackface moment as the thumbnail, and the scene appears to still be on Channel 4's version of it, which, you know, can we maybe not? Maybe it's not necessary. Yeah, that's a whole thing that happened, and to be honest, if Always Sunny can't style out blackface with the characters are terrible people so they do terrible things, then I don't think Peep Show can get away with it either. Also, not for nothing, but Jez is really weird about Johnson, who is his love rival and one of the few supporting characters of note who's black, and it always kind of jars, and it's interesting but not the subject of this video, that there's noticeable weirdness around black people related to sex stuff in the show. Although in Mark's case, I think it's just him liking when a guy is rude to him from a position of authority, independent of race. I'm gonna leave that one alone. There's also a little bit of Mark and Jez both being homophobic and transphobic, though this is mostly confined to their inner monologues, and it doesn't really stand out in the same way it does in other contemporaneous shows in the UK. Like, Jez in his internal monologue uses a slur for trans people, and Mark is really weird about gay people and is weird in a gay club. Unlike the blackface, this isn't as jarring, and it does kind of fit in with the way the characters are throughout the series. I suppose part of this is that even now, with the way things are around LGBTQ+ rights in the UK, the 2000s really were quite different, and the show is making fun of them mostly, making them seem either like weird losers or just uptight about something that frankly has nothing to do with them. Guess which character indulges in which one? It's not a big aspect of the show, but I do think it's worth noting that Peep Show very much is a product of the time it was made. Although in some ways, that time seems to be like 1964. So there's that. The reason this stuff stands out isn't just that I'm watching it in 2025 and it offends my delicate modern sensibilities. The 2000s hardly qualify as a different time. It's more that an overwhelming majority of the show feels like it was made with some joy, and these elements don't feel like that. Obviously, that's irrelevant to the question of should you do blackface. If anything, doing it with joy would be even more of a red flag. Anyway, that's been the mandatory SK is talking about British comedy, so they have to talk about blackface and homophobia segment. Hope you all got your money's worth with that one. One thing that's quite surprising when you go back to the first season of the show is that Mark and Jez's relationship seems almost entirely cordial. Part of me wonders if this is just the part before they found their groove and the characters necessarily became ensconced in this pocket universe of unreality they inhabit, but it is interesting that their relationship deteriorates. A lot of the catalyst for this is just that Mark and Jez are dicks and are inflicting horrible things on each other. It's remarkable how many episodes contain an essentially unforgivable transgression against the other, which is one of the factors that contributes to this sense that they're choosing to live in their own little world and inevitably struggle when dealing with anything outside of that. I don't know why I flicked my hair there. I was just going for drama, I guess. A good comparison would be literally any scene in Always Sunny where the gang sits across a desk from anyone. Obviously, Peep Show is generally less extravagant in how badly these things go, but it's definitely there. There's a sort of parallel at play. Something else I find interesting about Mark and Jez that also contributes as the show goes on to the sense that they're dislocated from the world is that the way they live and the type of guy they are can't really exist anymore. Really, they stopped existing during the run of the show. The archetypes they lean into really do belong to that era the show started in. So do the characters' ambitions, whether it's Mark's desire to climb up the corporate ranks in order to obtain some degree of satisfaction with his life, or Jez's seemingly eternal wait to hit the big time, even if he didn't put any work into it. Neither the ambitions or the material results of them are familiar to anyone anymore, either to the consummate, backbiting, aspirational, greasy pole climbing prick, or to the ludicrously work-shy wannabe musician. They only really work as normal, for want of a better term, in the early seasons before a combination of the unforgivable transgressions and the fact that they have to experience the decline of peak centrism, especially around the financial crash, and the fact that their lifestyle that they choose becomes less and less viable through a combination of both, which is one of the reasons why the characters started to both feel and be really weird. Part of that is just the show finding its groove and knowing where it can and can't push a little, with some mixed results as the aforementioned blackface suggests. A significant part of it is just that their lives are, through the stagnation imposed on them through the narrative loop of every series, just totally separating them from reality and making them clash horribly with everyone. Despite all of this, I actually think these characters really suit this kind of series where they're just punished over and over again in some of the most ludicrous ways. The show almost accidentally makes itself more compelling through the way David Mitchell and Robert Webb play themselves and inflict these horrors on their avatars. It's not especially insightful, at least not on purpose, and they're both shits in their own way. Despite this, they've produced, I think, the best centrist work of art, both in terms of the show actually being enjoyable to watch, but also in reflecting that ideology, whether by accident or on purpose. They have managed to capture this moment and express it in a really entertaining way. Another way Peep Show does a good job of reflecting these ideological tendencies of the writers is in its narrative loop. The structure of the series as a whole resembles a fractal pattern, one of those patterns where you keep zooming in and there's still detailed structure that resembles the macro scale. I'll throw up an animation of one so you know what I mean, in case you're not a geometry enjoyer like I was when I was younger. Peep Show works in the same way, and I think the show could only have ended the way it did because of that. If you take the show as a whole, from Series 1 Episode 1 to Series 9 Episode 6, we go from Mark and Jez in their flat, a bit of familiarity breeding contempt, and both dealing with romantic issues while not being where they want to be in their lives, to Mark and Jez in their flat, watching the TV, familiarity breeding contempt, and both dealing with romantic issues while not being where they want to be in their lives. The long arc of the show tends towards the typical structure of a sitcom. That is a restoration of the status quo. Mark and Jez certainly go through a lot in this series. I mean, Mark has a son. Jez joins a cult, then unjoins it. Jez moves out, then back in multiple times. They both go through multiple relationships with varying degrees of success and commitment, and yet they both end up where they started, just older and having made everyone in their lives hate them. This also works on the series and episodic scale. Every episode tries to pull them back towards some kind of functional status quo that isn't that different to the start. There can be little differences, and even, as does happen in many sitcoms, big milestones.
Minimal water damage.
And this can add up. As I mentioned, Mark and Jez aren't static beings throughout the story, but the ultimate destination is things regressing to how it always was. The milestones that would otherwise change our lives, the lives of real people, just don't do it for them. In part because they are fictional characters, and the other part is that these two are just such awful, hollowed out people that it's impossible to see them exist outside of the unreality they wallow in. A good series that highlights this is Series 4, which centers on the run-up to Mark's wedding and how that all plays out. Now, I think you could do this with basically any series that isn't the first one, where there's a bit less of this serialization. I picked Season 4 because it has a line that is absolutely perfect for making my point, and also I love the scale of the fiascos they get into. Like, Jez eats a dog in this series in an attempt to cover up killing that same dog. It's amazing how fucked it is. Series 4 is a really Mark-heavy season. As the show goes on, Mark seems to take center stage more often than Jez, or at least it feels like that to me, which makes some sense because to the extent that there are significant milestones that happen to the characters, they tend to happen to Mark. And in fairness, this particular series is the run-up to his wedding, so he's obviously going to have a bit more light shone on him. If we take the situation as a whole, what's happening is Mark is hurtling towards a wedding that he probably doesn't want to go through with because of social embarrassment. Beyond the usual nerves and all of that stuff that might happen, in almost every episode up until the wedding, Mark is given a way out of the situation. An opportunity to break the status quo that's hurtling him towards disaster. Can you feel the analogy for centrism? I could pick any of the 5 episodes where this opportunity is presented to Mark, but because I mentioned it earlier, and because it's just such a bizarre series of escalations, I'm going to talk about episode 5, Holiday, where Jez has arranged for a stag do for Mark's wedding, both having accepted that this is going to happen. In fairness, it does seem like a nice time going down a canal with your best mate. I maybe wouldn't play the chess and would spend more time in the pub, but yeah, it's pretty good. It seems pretty good. They end up trying to chat up a pair of sisters in the pub, go back to their place, and Mark is offered his way out, a potential move to India. Sure, the move might involve having to be with the deeply unpleasant daughter of his potential future boss, which some might see as a lateral move, but you can always iron out details later. It's fine, there's always terms and conditions, don't worry about it. This is all brought down, for once not by Mark's own cowardice or greed, but instead by Jez's lust. Is it lust motivating this? This incidentally is a good example of the kind of transgression against a friend that would likely be fatal to a friendship. Killing your future boss's dog, roping you into its disposal, and then eating it at your job interview is pretty much me being done with you. Just in case any of my friends are watching, it turns out there are lines. I don't care what we've been through, I'm just disowning you there and then. It's over. As you might imagine, this ruins Mark's escape plan to go to India, which in his head would free him from the obligation to go through with the wedding, at least for a little while. A long enough while to not think about it. Like, how I did my master's degree to avoid having to think about what I wanted to do when I grew up. It wasn't this. This wasn't what I had in mind. All of this means that Mark is back at the series baseline of he's going to get married to Sophie despite literally every single indication being that he shouldn't do this. Over the course of the series, each episode pulls Mark back into the reality that he's getting married. And seemingly nothing, not him confessing to his future father-in-law that he doesn't love Sophie, not his web of lies almost collapsing at the gym, not even hiding in the church on the day could spare him from the disaster, which of course it was a disaster and resulted in Sophie running away from it all and crying and Mark and Jez going back to the flat together, like always. It's quite something, the extent to which reality bends to compel Mark and Jez back to their status quo across the show's run, usually because of the flaws they can never work past. As time goes on, the status quo becomes more and more obviously unsustainable and stands out, especially as we get to see the lives of the supporting characters, yet it becomes so much harder for them to break out of. A good example is Super Hans, who I can't believe I've not talked about more, because what an icon.
Tell you what, that crack is really moreish.
When we see more of his life when Jez has to inevitably move into his bag, what we see is a perfectly nice room that his gran stayed in. And he does seem, with some rough edges, to lead an interesting and full life, which is in contrast to Mark and Jez, who seem to have very little meaningful inner life, despite Mark's attempts to pose as having one, and the brief flashes of it he displays. And Jez being the stereotypical artistic sort who should, in quotes, because, you know, I've met this kind of person, and let me tell you, they did kind of cook with the character of Jez, have some kind of internality, and he just doesn't. There's this great scene in the last series where Jez gets absolutely torn apart by Megan, whose boyfriend he stole, and her dismantling of Jez is so spot on that I just have to let her say her piece here.
You were basically uninteresting, and you hide behind this mask of, like, slacker bullshit. Like, the fact you've never done anything with your life is some kind of Gen X lifestyle choice, when really, it's just because you're a small, talentless worm.
Part of the reason they're both not just Jez, who I realise I've dunked on a lot here, like this, is that they're fundamentally choosing to be detached from the world and keep clinging to each other in this toxic arrangement that clearly stopped working for them sometime around 2008. The characters even acknowledge how bizarre the world they inhabit is. To bring it back to Series 4, there's a part where it all comes crashing down on Mark once Jez is pissing himself and the piss is leaking through the ceiling, and he says,
God, this has got to be a dream. Nothing this bad could ever happen in reality.
He's right. If I had to pick out a point where the show starts to get very odd about it and really embraces the tensions between Mark, who's this perfect sort of neoliberal subject, and Jez, who's a false wannabe subversive who repeatedly folds into the mainstream as it suits him and doesn't really even have the intellectual depth to defend that, as well as their tensions with their friends and a world that's clearly moving on while they just stay stuck permanently in this pre-2008 world, wishing it was all the same as it once was, and they weren't obviously antiquated and obsolete, which they clearly are. After the wedding and its consequences, plus the experience they have going through the 2008 crash, the show begins to feel more and more like it's out of time, or at least out of step by enough of a margin that you start to notice it more. Part of that is that the gaps, both narratively and in release, get larger, which makes sense because how do these characters survive the things they've put each other through to regress to the status quo? And what can you do with these characters besides continuously escalate? I actually think the later series have value because of this disconnection, and I actually quite enjoy the morphing into this force that sucks people in around them into their bullshit, as if they live in this pocket universe of 2006 and everyone else regresses whenever they're in contact. It's ironic given the time of year this is likely coming out, but it's a lot like visiting your parents for Christmas. The final series feels like the inevitable regression. There are these moments peppered throughout that tease this idea that they're almost ready to accept the way things are and act to change their lives. But of course, they both decide to wallow. Mark in his pursuit of April, that girl from the shoe shop he stalked, and his attempt to break up her marriage, which is something of a recurring theme for Mark, actually, married women, something to think about on his part, I guess. Jez decides to pursue going forward as a free, which more power to him, but it doesn't go well, and inevitably his critical character flaws and the fact that he has nothing of substance about him catches up with him. It's almost as if these people know what the problems are, but can't really bring themselves to solve it because it'd be too disruptive for them. Which obviously builds up to what I think is the best send-off they could have given the show. So full disclosure, I don't tend to really enjoy final episodes very much because a lot of endings just kind of fumble it at the end, and sometimes it's impossible to deliver on the hype, and that's okay. Like, once you learn to sort of adjust for it, it's fine. But Peep Show really nails it. The final episode revolves around two key stories. One is Jez's 40th birthday, which he's feeling a little sensitive about, and I do kind of sympathize. Not that I'm 40 or anything, but I sympathize a little. And the other is about Mark's pursuit of April coming to its final stage. The 40th birthday is just a perfect catastrophe. Jez and Hans have taken Angus, Mark's love rival, hostage, all while Jeremy is found out again because it turns out he lied about turning 40, which, you know, isn't a big deal, and I'm sure I will be normal about that in 9 years. Considering I fled the UK to go to Spain for my 31st birthday, I'm not feeling super confident about that. The guests at Jez's birthday are mostly people who seem to hate him, which makes a lot of sense because Mark and Jez have engaged in a lot of beef and never really resolved them. All of this predictably is a disaster and results in Super Hans being left by his wife, the kidnapping being revealed. Oh yeah, Mark gets fired sometime earlier, and Jez is dumped, which as far as 40th birthdays go is a lot, but it's so good and it's a satisfying way for these two to at least get some of what's coming to them. When I was thinking about this, the comparison that made sense here was Always Sunny in Philadelphia. It once again sprang to my mind because here we have a pair of people living in unreality, and the show has a long run, 9 series in Peep Show's case, over 12 years. Now it's interesting that Always Sunny has just had this amazing latest season and has managed to retain relevance in a way that Peep Show didn't. Part of that is, I think it's harder to push things in a lot of directions with a main cast of 2, but they even hit a lot of the same beats across the shows, but because of who the creators are, they probably didn't have the flexibility to keep that show going, and arguably accepting that led to this very good final episode where they could leave the pair in their fractal of disaster, and it feels right. There's this temptation that always exists with a show you like to say that it should have carried on, or it's a shame there isn't more of it, or that it had something to say that could be relevant now. But I do think Peep Show just belonged to that era, particularly that era of the first 5 or 6 seasons. It's probably for the best that the show ended, and it was clearly running its course, and a lot of shows struggle with knowing when and how to bow out. It's especially fortunate, given the way the views of David Mitchell and Robert Webb have evolved, that we have this as evidence that they were always kind of like this. That the act of playing themselves liberated them to say the things that they'd only feel liberated to say once the world they inhabited as these characters had well and truly been left behind. For the series to end in 2015, which marks the beginning of the first collapse of the British Centre, is unintentionally pure poetry. British comedy struggled to deal with this first collapse, and the current collapse is not really being handled spectacularly either, but for different reasons. If the show had continued past the current ending, it would have not just felt like a relic from a bygone era, but I think would have found itself with nowhere to go, and that would have squandered the greatness of the show, which is that it says so much without meaning to, and it's just very good. It's rare that I can engage with a work made by people with such a different worldview and that's rooted in a period of time that sucked. And I know younger people in the audience may well look at the 2000s and think fondly of it, but I promise you, for most of us, it was still pretty shit. We were just shielded from it because we were kids. So yeah, Rare Centrist W, Peep Show is all yours, and it's good, and I'm happy to leave it there. I'm back, baby. The videos are back. With that, everyone, I need to thank the proofreader for this video, who did a fantastic job giving me some notes, who also really likes this show and had a lot to say about it in the general discussion. I also need to thank the patrons and members, but before I do, if you enjoyed the video, remember to like, comment, subscribe. I don't know how the algorithm works anymore. Like, I don't know if it helps, I don't know if it hurts. Just do random stuff now. Just do whatever you want on the video. As long as it's on this video, do whatever you want. Share it, you know, post about your favorite Peep Show episode. I don't care, do something. Who knows how the algorithm works anymore? But I want to thank the top tier patrons, Drone Riff, Kersey Scheider, Liron, Jar Jar Moober, and Carolyn. Don't know why I struggled with Carolyn there. That's a bit of a weird one. And I also want to thank the YouTube members, Nadir Jiwa, Katie Marshall, Roger Zugi, Ben Johnson. Thank you to them. If you want early access to stuff, if you want all of the goodies, just all of the goodies, you can join the Patreon or the YouTube membership, whatever you prefer. I am back, kind of. I had a bit of a weird November combination of being just kind of upset and unwell. It was a really, really weird time. It was a weird month. I'm sure I'll tell you all about it another time. But I'm back, but I don't know if I'll be doing another video before Christmas. I might. It's possible. But just in case I don't, everyone who's celebrating Merry Christmas and Happy New Year to everyone. Hopefully, I will see you all very soon. There might be a new one. Actually, I don't know why I said Happy New Year. There's going to be one before New Year. I've planned that out. But whatever. If you're not there for that one, Happy New Year, I guess. Right. With that, everyone, bye. Take it easy. I will catch you all on the next one. And I'm back. I'm officially back. Also, before I go, everyone, please admire the strawberry tiger on my shirt. This is the best shirt that I own now. It's so good. All right. See ya.